The best vertical AI companies, they solve one hard problem for one specific industry, and they do it better than anyone else. Too many founders try to be everything to everyone. Big teams, complex roadmaps, slow, ponderous sales cycles. The winners, those are the guys who go narrow and deep. They build with compliance in mind from day one. They understand and are anticipating their cost to serve as they grow. They know who writes the check, and they design to win that specific person over. So, how do you spot a vertical AI startup that's built to last? And how do you avoid the traps that drain your first funding round? I'm Tom Travis, and joining me today is Rachel Ten Brink, general partner and founder of Red Bike Capital. She's a former founder who scaled Scentbird to 500,000 plus subscribers and spent 2 decades building across multi-billion-dollar brands at Estee Lauder, L'Oreal, and Gillette. Rachel's here to share perspective for building vertical AI companies, the kind that don't just raise money, but survive the regulatory gauntlet and scale with discipline. She's also got a super interesting story, so we'll make sure we get a glimpse of her personal and professional journey as we go. Rachel, great to have you. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Tom. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, let's go ahead and jump in. Rachel, you've built startups as an operator, and now you're backing founders at Red Bike. I was wondering if you could share sort of your operator's test for whether a vertical AI startup is truly a product business versus a services wrapper, and what evidence do you want to see as an investor at pre-seed and seed?
So I think that, so let's separate those two questions. So I think the first question on whether it's a wrapper or a real company is, what level of problem are you solving? How much of it can be fully automated versus having to have a service level? Um, and is it truly something that is a need or a want? So that's the way I think about it. So the first part is, what are you truly solving, right? And I think what's really important here is, there's Sam Altman famously said in one of the podcasts I think a year ago, you know, every time the model gets better, does your business become more valuable or less valuable, right? So I think that's something we talk a lot about in terms of, are you just solving sort of a pain point that eventually can be solved by a general model, or are you really creating a valuable company? I think the second piece of it is, are you building something that can be replicable, can service multiple customers, or are you going to have to come in and it's basically, 30% product and then 70% people customizing. And then you're basically becoming a consulting company or a services company. And I think the third piece of it is, what is the scalability of it? How big can this get, right? So those are the things I think about. When you're thinking about, pre-seed and seed, obviously it's very, very early days. There might be, we prefer to have some revenue, some value, some validation that people want this, right? It doesn't need to be huge volumes of revenue, but some revenue. Because ultimately, my biggest validation I always say is, it's not the revenue, even though revenue is absolutely great. It's surely not fundraising, even though brings a lot of ego and obviously helps. But the most important part is customer love. Can I talk to a customer who's using this and telling me why they're in there for the ride, particularly early on when it might be a little bumpy and the product might not be great, but that customer is hanging on because you're doing something really valuable for them. That to me is the ultimate test.
Yeah, that really resonates. You're snapping me back to my very first company when I still had an awful lot to learn, still do. But in that first company, we had built a product that required, by its fundamental design in the space we were in, it required last mile customization, tailoring, and calibration for the customer. But what we sort of saw, and I hear you getting to this point, is that if there's this huge services footprint, well, you don't really have a scalable software business. The other lesson we learned, though, is that the more that you sort of nourish the services requirement of a company like that, the further your engineers get from the end customer reality, right? And
Yeah.
so the takeaway was, okay, we got to just let there be very little
Compressed.
daylight or no daylight, right, between the customer reality, the customer pain, and the engineers who are building what you hope is a scalable product.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, Everybody talks a lot these days, Rachel, about moats, data network effects, data flywheels. And this is one of my favorite topics. We spend a lot of time in our shop attending to it. I was wondering if you could give some examples of winning data network effects and say a little bit about how they come into being, right? So the question here, and I think there have been some companies who kind of luck their way into them. They weren't designed at the get, but they kind of became evident as the company goes. We think a lot about, wait, is it possible to actually embed a data flywheel or a data network
Mm.
effect at design time into the core
Exactly.
engine of a company?
And I think that's exactly the point is if you can find partners that actually you are encouraging your user to provide more proprietary data, more private data, because that data makes your product even more valuable. That makes the product incredibly sticky, right? And so that is where I think there is incredible um, value. I think that the other way to do it is even if it's publicly available information, is it difficult to understand? Is it difficult to distill? So, for example, we invested in a company in the healthcare space. And their first product was around the fact that when the No Surprises Act came, insurance companies were forced to publish what they were paying for out of network providers. Now, obviously, insurance companies were not happy about it. They create, it's very hard to understand this data. It's all over the place. It's not, synthesized in a way that's very usable. So their first product was a database of that information. Now, that's great, but there were other competitors in the space that could use that data. That what they realized was, well, what else can these providers, right? Because the providers were using the data to understand, okay, if I'm a anesthesiologist in Ohio and Aetna tells me they're going to pay me $400 for this out of network service, and I think it should be 4,000. How much should I be getting paid? But really, the next question was, well, what happened if they weren't? If they Aetna said, sorry, that's it. And there is legally a process, which is an arbitration. And what's interesting about the arbitration process is that it's a little bit like baseball arbitration, where each side puts in a bid. And whatever that bid is, the arbitrator picks one and that's it. So there's incredible value in having the information. Now, the insurance company has a lot of information, but now the providers have the information, number one. And then number two, it goes into the workflow question. So now they're leveraging public data in a proprietary way and workflows because for arbitration, you had very complex, very time constrained. They only have, I think, about 3 months to, process these arbitrations. So AI does a great job at processing it. So anyway, the company has done great, and I think it's a really interesting conversation around, you know, some proprietary data, but some public data, but also combining it with workflows to create a moat.
I love that. And man, that really resonates in terms of the build outs here. Let's underscore that idea. Public data, and there's a lot of it, but processed and and managed in a way that creates proprietary net new data,
Exactly.
right? I think that's such a powerful modality. And we'll come back to this maybe as we go here, but there are a lot of companies that are just providing these thin little wrappers around an LLM. And it's not clear to us, at least, how durable they can be because there's no net new data. There's nothing necessarily proprietary about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
So, and I think that's the point is like my and I come from, sort of a marketing world and a market research world where like data is overflowing. And my point has always been, well, what do I do with this information, right? How is this data really usable in a way that's highly valuable to your end consumer that's unique to anybody else? And that's when you have the value. So I thought that's what's interesting about that example.
totally. Hey, let's change gears here a little bit. I know Red Bike focuses on helping startups with go to market and growth. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about your specific value add and your process, right? What kind of go to market wedges have you seen repeatedly work for vertical AI? How do you design them? How do you implement them? And what are some key traps to avoid?
Sure. So I was actually listening to one of your earlier podcasts about Cruise and their 9 value propositions, and it made my eyes pop because that's one of my, "Oh, no." I think the first thing you have to do is really like, what are you selling and to whom, right? What's your ICP? What do they really, really care about? I know it's a very different industry, but when we started Scentbird, which is a subscription service for fragrances, we were going after consumers buying fragrances. We had several theories, and they all seem kind of useful, right? Like maybe people just hate being sprayed in the face when they go into Macy's. Maybe they just find it confusing and overwhelming, or maybe they just want a little time to try things at home. And all of these seemed reasonable. And the point is, we couldn't market all of them. Not all those benefits were equal. And I think that's really important when you're doing vertical AI, particularly where it's a more sophisticated uh, purchaser. Like really, really prioritize what are the benefits and you know maybe top 3, but really the key one, right? And how is everything supporting that? So spending a lot of time, um, sort of like I think a lot of founders intuitively know, the best founders know deeply the problem they're solving, but the why, the who else is having this problem and why are they spending money? Why are they buying it? So we spent a lot of time on that messaging. And then the second piece of it is the storytelling, right? Uh, People, particularly with vertical, with these large contracts, when you're looking at enterprise clients, they're buying the whole story. Yes, they're buying a solution. Yes, their technical team has to buy off, but they need to believe in the vision and you might not have it all fully built out. So you need that storytelling. So I think that's really important of that first step of before you even talk, like have some theories, have some hypotheses, talk to as many customers as you can. Don't kind of hide behind just like doing online like there should be some qualitative and there should be some quantitative testing to this, and have a good grasp. Obviously, it will continue to evolve and mature, but have a good grasp of that value proposition. So I think that's a big piece of that first step. And it should be, a couple of weeks, but that's really like that message fit. I think the second piece to your point about marketing wedges is, what's your playbook? That's what I call it, right? Um, for some, for some it's product led growth, for some it's conferences, for some it's white papers, for some it's LinkedIn. Um, and the truth is, when you're very, very early on, you probably can't do all of those very well. Um, so you're going to have to, and you're probably not going to know exactly what works, but, spend some time, think through it, think about not only what works and what's going to give you the results, but what are your capabilities? What can you do really, really well? For example, product led growth, PLG sounds great. But guess what? If your product isn't fully built out, if your product doesn't quite sell itself today, then maybe that's not the best, uh, road to follow. It might be something, in a couple of months you might be there, but day one, maybe you start more with founder led or you start with conferences. So I think being really pragmatic about the playbook that works for you today, and then how can you scale it? Um, I think the fourth stage that we think a lot about is like, what's your pipeline? What you got? Right? Who are you talking to? How are you thinking of these people? How are you connecting? Have you figured out, can you get to them on LinkedIn? How can you get a warm intro? I mean, ultimately, we're all selling to humans. So it's not that different to getting LPs or getting investors. Like, how do you get that warm intro? How do you differentiate? How do you get um, good word of mouth? And, nothing is better than a good product for good word of mouth, right? People who love your product. So hyper focusing on a few great customers that are going to start saying great things is a really smart um, strategy. But then building out, okay, these people that I'm focusing on, who do they know? How can I get that pipeline and building it out? And then the last one, and it goes into the do things that don't scale is like figure out who's in your network, right? As an investor, um, it's probably the most non-scalable thing I do, but like I have a huge LinkedIn. I've worked in a lot of industries. My partner Herman has worked in finance and credit, and so between the two of us, we know a lot of enterprise people. Like, don't be shy. find your investors, find your networks, and have those warm connections to get those early logos makes a difference.
Yeah, that's a treasure trove of really great input. I want to kind of come back to you on a couple of key points and lessons learned over here. First, uh, on the topic of doing unscalable things, it's funny because I've said along the way, companies are like your children, right? They do things that are developmentally appropriate at different stages.
Yeah,
They're babies, then they're toddlers, they're prepubescents, adolescents, eventually young adults, you hope. So don't carry on like you're an adult when you're a toddler still, right?
absolutely.
And
Yeah, and
and that's
you're gonna trip and fall, right? Like,
totally, yeah. And so in a context now where everybody loves to talk about scale and discipline, and we do this, right? We talk out of both sides of our mouth. Absolutely. Design time decisions that ensure future scale are really important. But, in with the teams I work with, I like to talk about blueberries and pancakes as an example of, okay, that's completely unscalable. I say, oh, but the customer said they want blueberries and pancakes on Tuesday at 7:30. And then a co-founder says, yeah, but we're a software company. We don't do blueberries and pancakes. And I said, no, no, we're going to do blueberries and pancakes because at this early stage, whatever it takes, right, to make this specific customer not just mediocre happy, but dazzled and over the moon happy, right?
I think that you always have to have this mindset that, 0 to I always say if you don't do 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, you don't get to 1,000, and you certainly don't get to 1,000,000,000, right? Like, and so this idea that you kind of do things handmade is the best way I explain it, to your point about the pancakes. Like, you do these, like, now, the problem is you cannot build it so that it can never shift from the hand, right? Like, if it's always gonna have to be handmade, then that doesn't work. But if that's what's gonna get the flywheel going, and that's where you have to be very thoughtful and pragmatic, absolutely, right? So I think that, and I think your point about, like, you want super happy early customers, not just because you need early revenue, right? You're gonna have to go out and fundraise and prove to someone that you're making some money, but it's also like it sets the tone for so many other things. As I was saying, early word of mouth, right? That engineer talks to that engineer. That head of growth actually moved to that other company and brought the product along, whatever may be. um, it's going to set the tone for your engineers, for your own team to be like, okay, we've got some wins. We all need this, right? Like, I just think it's like you cannot strive for perfection. You also can't be too sloppy, but you have to think about, like, how are you gonna get the train moving?
Right. No, my co-founder Vivek likes to say when we're talking about some of those 10 to 100 problems at the early stage. That sounds like a problem for future self. In other words, like, please God, give me those problems.
That's a high class prize. I know, it's like I was talking to somebody and they're like, "Well, what if we get too many requests for demos?" I'm like, "Good for you. Don't worry about it.
Those are first world
Excellent. Go
issues.
figure that out."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The other idea you mentioned I wanted to come back to quickly and really underscore is just the importance of having a theory of the user or the buyer and having those hypotheses, as you call them, and then being prepared to revise at any moment.
Yeah.
Right. So, and not, I see so many founders kind of dwell in abstractions and use a lot of jazz hands to talk about the segments or the customers they're talking to. And I'm always like, look, it's time for us to put on our safari hats, get into the jungle, pull out our recorders. What exactly did they say? What do
Yeah.
they eat for breakfast? And where do they go for lunch? And what do they just understand everything, right? Just get anthropological about your user.
Well, and I think that in this world, again, product-led growth, a lot of, like, sort of touchless selling, it sort of gets very easy to just get lost in the data and the numbers and how many people signed up and how many people went in the newsletter. And it's like, I always, the way my framework is always, you need some quantitative, you need some critical mass. And then my favorite thing to do is to look through that quantitative and see where either the very negative or the outliers, the very negative or the very positive, and then go to qualitative. So, for example, what we used to do at Scentbird is run surveys but I would always include a few open-ended questions. And the reason for that is that I wanted to be able to identify from the open-ended questions which people were most articulate, which people were articulating problems that others weren't identifying, which people were really willing to talk. Because I mean, you're never going to have time to talk to thousands of customers and really, put on your safari hat with so many. You want to pick the ones that are really giving you the insights, and so doing a little bit of filtering up top and getting some sort of macro level insights is great. But then to your point, like you gotta, and I think that particularly for a lot of technical founders that like they just don't want to deal with people.
Right.
like
That's
like,
right.
it's
Yeah.
not the most organic thing. Um, you got to do it. I have one of our founders, young guy, super technical. Um, and I'm fascinated by him because what he's figured out is he's very, very technical, and he has an accent. I have an accent too.
Mhm.
Um, and so sometimes it's a little bit hard on Zoom. And this guy figured it out. He just hops on a plane. He will be like, "Oh, introduced you to XYZ client. Oh, I happen to be in Chicago on Monday. Would you like to
Mhm.
meet in person?" Right? And like he is just closing logos because he's figured out that he needs to go in deep, not just be sort of sheltered in that demo.
Big ups to that guy, whoever he is. And a big plus one for like hopping on a plane. I love that. I use that line all the time. I just happen to be in Chicago.
What a
I'm not.
surprise.
I'm in Chicago about to stage a hunger strike in your lobby. Let's
Yeah.
talk. You got to do
Yes.
it eyeball to eyeball.
Exactly.
Hey, let's come back, Rachel. You mentioned the founder with the high class champagne problems. What if I have too many leads? Um, so let's switch gears a little and talk about the things that break when a vertical AI company is on the move and starting to scale fast, right? Because we shouldn't be too dismissive. These champagne problems, again, please God, let me have those problems. But then they
Yeah.
can also crush companies. So is it possible, do you think, to sort of see things before they fly off the rails? What are the common sort of scaling failure points and how do you guard against them?
So I would sort of split that into sort of product problems and then growth problems, because those are the most common ones I see. So I think when you start to see problems on the product side is, hallucinations, all of a sudden the accuracy starts to break down, the stability starts to break down. So I do think that, keeping a very close tab and really listening to your customer, like a very short, easy shortcut is like, are the humans in the loop, are they way more in the loop than you expected them to or that you sold when you sold the product? Right? Like that's already telling you, what's going on here? Why are all these people in the loop when we sold them something that wasn't in the loop. So I think that's a very important issue. Also, because you got to keep a close eye on your margins, and if you start to realize that. And it might be that the product is doing what it's supposed to do, but it's very hard to understand. It's very hard to implement. It's very hard to onboard. You're getting tons of questions. You're having your account exec spend hours and hours, and all of a sudden, a product that was supposed to be self serve and that you're selling for, I don't know, $50 a month, and if you have somebody spending 2 or 3 hours a month helping that person, you have no margins, right? Very quickly. And so I think that keeping an eye on that side of the product is really, really important as you start to scale, because, you can afford to do things by hand early, but you might need to, I've seen companies where like they just take a break on onboarding customers for 2 weeks and really address what are the product issues, what are the model issues. Like, sometimes those types of, take a breather, do a sprint, focus on product before you onboard anybody else are really, really important because again, you might be like drowning in demand, but you're still early in the race and you still need to have a great product and a great experience, and the last thing you want is a leaky bucket with lots of churn.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that full on, full off approach, right?
Yeah.
I find for any company, there's usually one big problem that needs to be solved at any given time. And so, yes, you have to walk and chew
Yeah.
gum at the same time and keep the business rolling. But I love the idea, for example, okay, we've got a product scalability problem. Stop new customers for 2 weeks and it's just going to be full guns
And I think what's really important is to be realistic but time constrained.
Hmm.
Because that way you can also talk to the customer and give them some sense of expectation. I mean, the worst thing you can do is ghost a customer, right? You want to give them some sense of expectation. It also gives the team some like fire under their butt, like this needs to get done, and very specificity, right? Like those are the moments where you start to say, okay, we have all these XYZ features we want to focus on, but this is where the resources need to go right now.
That's right.
So I think that's super, super important as you're scaling there. And it goes back to that point about like the stages and the maturity levels. Everybody loves to show these charts where everything goes straight up and to the right. And that's just not the life of startups. That's not the reality, right? There's a lot of this. There's a lot of like, maybe you have to like drop revenue a little bit. I mean, as an investor, I hate it, but that's the reality. Like maybe
Hmm.
you take a step back to take a step forward. There's gonna be a lot of this before you do that. Um, so that's on
100%.
the product side, and then I was gonna say on the sales side, on the growth side, on the onboarding side, I think when I start to see, things break early on is that, initially, as I was saying, like, you gotta get the wheels turning, right? You gotta get the train going. And so, like, you might be taking every single type of customer that comes your way, right?
Right.
And at a certain point, if you're starting to drown on demand, you're gonna have to take a hard look at margins. You're gonna have to take the hard look. And we've seen it, over and over again where, you know, Brex is a great example where they decided like, SMBs aren't worth their time, right? Like tough decisions where like it might be a very easy customer to acquire, but guess what? The reason why they're easy to acquire is because nobody wants them because they're not making money on them. And so you either, and that doesn't mean that, so then you have to say, okay, either I can create a funnel that is purely touch free and I can simplify this product and this onboarding and this integration so that I never touch them and every new customer is pure margin, or you say, "You know what? That is not a segment I'm gonna focus on." And so that's the other part that I've seen starting to break is that, like, initially everybody, you're taking everybody and particularly with vertical AI, there's so much curiosity, but a lot of these customers are not good customers for you. Sometimes you have to fire a customer.
Since we're comparing notes here, Rachel, this is I'm right there with you. And a method that we've implemented with a lot of success, I'll share it here, is a 2 month what we call a proof of value. So it converts automatically to a SaaS contract. So it's not at the customer's option. It's a bona fide SaaS deal with where the
Yeah.
first 2 months are cancelable at any moment for free. What it's allowed us to do is to discern some of the customers. By the way, it's mutually cancelable, so we can and we can manage the customers who are going to basically kill the company. Right? You bring
Yeah.
them all the blueberries and pancakes you like. They're just going to take you right into the ditch if you stay with them. So it's a marvelous way for us of protecting risk and discerning. We want all the customers, but we've avoided a
Yeah.
couple major sort of existential threats by steering clear of a couple of those customers.
And what you realize is, like, bad customers come in different flavors, and they're not bad people, they're just bad customers, right? Some of them, it's, they're just too small, they just can't afford you, right? So that's a big part. There's also the other end, the very large enterprise that are just kinda using you to learn until their internal teams figure out how to build this, and you gotta be very careful as an eager beaver, founder that's just so excited to get these logos on your like, really figure out are these good customers or are they gonna kill you?
That's right. Well, listen, at the beginning, I mentioned your super interesting sort of personal story, and I was wondering, Rachel, if you could take us back and talk a little bit about what brought you to entrepreneurship and investing in the first place.
Sure. Well, I'll go way back 'cause, I always joke I am a Cuban, Costa Rican, Turkish German with a Dutch last name. So I'm a bit of a mutt. But, my dad, uh, was Cuban, he just recently passed away, but he was an incredible entrepreneur. And, an entrepreneur out of necessity. So, he left Cuba when he was 17, went to school here in the States, had corporate jobs. At some point, he worked at a bank. The company that he was servicing in the bank offered him a job in Costa Rica, and he ends up in Costa Rica, and that's how I was born there. Um, He doesn't know anybody. This is Costa Rica in the 70s, this tiny little backwater country. Um, and there weren't any jobs, right? So like the job that he had, that company went broke. It was a meat packer. What's he gonna do? And so he just had this incredible attitude of fixing problems, figuring out how to make money. And and that is something I truly admire. I mean, he was a wonderful man. He was very human, very warm, but and very kind to a lot of people, but he had a good sense of how to make money. And so he went through several businesses in Costa Rica. I always tell the story that, my first job was market research for my dad. At the time, had a tuna processing plant, and he had a local brand of canned tuna and first dolphin safe tuna in the 80s in Latin America. So we were very proud of this.
Hmm.
And I would spend Sundays hanging out in the supermarket, watching and tallying who would buy my dad's tuna brand and who would buy the other brands. And then I was like a 10-year-old and I'd come up to these, ladies shopping and be like, why did you buy that one? What were you thinking? Was it price? Did you trust the brand? And that, like, for me was my first introduction to entrepreneurship and to understanding customers, right?
And
Uh,
market research.
Yes,
Anytime.
always trying to like, who's your customers? What do they want? You can have a lot of thesis, but validate it. So yeah, so that was, I grew up in that very entrepreneurial environment. And then I came to college here in the States. And what's interesting is I didn't become an entrepreneur right away. I actually spent the first 15 years of my career building billion-dollar brands in very, very large enterprise organizations. So first, as you mentioned, with Gillette at Procter and Gamble in Boston. Then I was at Estee Lauder, L'Oreal, and I kind of surprised myself because at some point I was like, "Oh my god, am I ever going to do this?" Um, and so at some point, and I'll tell this because I think it's important to say, I had 2 young kids, I have a corporate job, and I'm like, "I don't want to be a corporate person. I'm gonna do this." So, I was at the time working for the CEO of Elizabeth Arden, and I struck a deal with her that I would work 4 days a week, and 1 day a week, I thought I was gonna be very smart and do consulting for early stage startups. Well, turns out consulting for early stage startups is a terrible idea. A, they have no money to pay
I
you,
was just gonna say, because they're all broke.
they're all broke. But B, more than that, the really smart founders, the founders you wanna work for, they already know they need to go from point A to point B. So, like, me coming in every Friday and telling them, "You should be doing X, Y, and Z," somewhat helpful. But what they really needed is, like, execution, like, get it done.
Yeah.
Um, so through that process, I did a bunch of terrible consulting projects, but I happened to meet my co-founder, Maria, and that's how Scentbird got started in 2014. So we co-founded Scentbird. There were 4 of us. We went through Y Combinator in the summer of 2015. So I always like to say I'm a bit of an OG. Um, and it was an incredible ride. So my role and one of the things that was interesting, it was a large team. It was, 4 co-founders is a lot of co-founders. I will say that. The flip side of that is that we were super capital efficient because we were paying ourselves nothing and we could cover a lot of ground, right? Andre was the CTO, he could ship. Sergey was designing product. I was doing all of our enterprise relationships and all of our so I was doing like B2B and B2C. So on the one hand was all of our enterprise sales, on the other was, you know, I would say live and die by CAC to LTV, right? What's your consumer? And Maria was CEO, fundraising, vision, recruiting. So it was an interesting because you don't see a lot of large teams like that. But that one actually worked, and, as you mentioned, we're well into the 9 figures with Scentbird, got named top YC company. It only took 9 years, um, but and there's a but, and to your point about, like, shifting sides, I really started to think about what I love to do, and to your point about, as companies mature, they become different people. I love the early stage. This stuff we're talking about positioning and go to market and like just figuring out how to get those first clients that really matter. That's my favorite stage. And so here I go again. I'm doing a lot of advisory work, advisory board. That eventually became angel investing. And at some point, we had my partner and I got together. We'd done well with the angel investing. We had, people who are like, "Hey, you guys have great access, you're seeing great deals." And that's how Red Bike was born. So it was a real um, evolution. It wasn't an nothing in my life is an overnight success. I will admit that.
Well, and just the concept of overnight success is itself fraught and
Oh,
never
I don't
corresponds.
believe any of it.
Right. Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. One final question I want to run by you here. So everybody in Silicon Valley, speaking of overnight successes, everybody loves the hero narratives, and it's usually like a company just went and slayed the dragon, in a year or two. Everybody was doing shots at midnight during hackathons, and it's like the Social Network movie, right? It kind of mythologizes what goes on. I myself sort of find that the stories about the bottom, right, the hardest moments, are usually the most impactful. So, said a slightly different way, the negative lessons are usually more powerful than the positive ones. So, I was wondering if you maybe share a story with us about the hardest moment in your professional journey, when everything seemed lost. What'd you do? How'd you turn it around?
So, and I completely agree. One of the things I always say as an operator turned VC is like, I've made tons of mistakes. If I can't prevent you, I can't tell you everything, but at least don't make the same ones I did, right? And I think for us, I just remember like a low point was at one point Scentbird wasn't born, as a subscription service with travel size sprays and all like, that's not at all what the initial concept was. It was always fragrance, and it was always this idea of discovery, but it was quite different. And so, again, this is 2014, Warby Parker is all the rage, try before you buy. So we thought we were gonna send people 3 bottles of perfume with 3 samples, try, keep what you like, ship back the rest. It was horrendous. So people were shipping back water. People were claiming that they didn't receive the bottles. Also, from a cash flow perspective, if you're sending 3 bottles of perfume, that's probably around $200 in inventory. And then you're paying for shipping for fragrance back and forth. It was horrible. So I, but we're at this point where we're about to run out of money. We're literally 4 of us sitting around a conference room and, we're like, okay, I remember it was something like 112 visitors to our website and 2 bought. It was horrifically bad. Like, it was those days where, like, we would be meeting daily to see how many people would even come to our website, and it was, like, under 150. Um, and I think the lesson was that we were really at the low point. We're like, "Right, we're gonna throw in the towel. This is a horrible idea." And one of our advisors, Michael Seibel, um, actually had a conversation, said, you guys really know this market. You know the market really well. You haven't figured out execution at all, but you know this market. You know this problem. Um, and we were literally sitting in this room about to go like, do we go create, completely different ideas? We were thinking about a scheduler for after school classes. We were thinking about a product for marketing automation. And this was 2014. There was a lot of work to be done. Like it was, like, we were going to do completely different things. And then after the weekend, um, we all kind of took a breath and we were running out of money, we were running out of time, we were done. Maria was like, I went to Sephora and I found these little travel sprays. What if we tried that?" And I went, "You know what? The market's gonna I don't know if the incumbents are gonna like it because this idea of travel sprays, like we're creating it, could be quite controversial, but I think people want this. Let's try it." And we tried it. It stuck. It was controversial initially. Eventually, I will tell you, and this is something that I tell a lot of founders, is like the best cure is revenue and traction, right? Eventually, we had over 1 million subscribers and everybody wanted to work with us, right? Um, but it was just such like I just remember this moment of like giving up and it was really that proverbial like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Right? Like, we were gonna give up on everything. We weren't like, I don't know if we were even gonna work to like, we were all very committed to working on something, so I think we would have stayed together, but we were gonna do something completely different, and just saying, "Okay, the execution is wrong, but there's something here." I think that's really powerful. That was really a lesson for me.
Well, sounds like you were on the bubble, but it also sounds like you guys were not going to go out like punks. You were going to die with your gun in your hand. So, and it all worked out. So
It did,
I
and
love your
listen, I
story.
mean, it doesn't always, and I think that's really important to have those honest conversations, um, but it was great.
Really great. Well, Rachel, so awesome to have you with us here today. I really appreciate all of these insights, all of these stories. They're inspiring absolutely to me, and I'm sure to all of our listeners. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom, it was really a pleasure.
Okay, that wraps up this episode of the Closed Session Podcast. I want to thank Rachel Tenbrink, general partner and founder at Red Bike Capital, for joining us. If you'd like to contact Rachel, you can find her LinkedIn profile in our show notes or closedsessionpod.com. You can also visit Rachel's company at redbikecapital.com. If you haven't subscribed yet and want regular insights about company building in your podcast feed, hit that subscribe button in your favorite podcast app or follow us on YouTube. That's all for today. Until next time, keep cranking, keep building.